Lecture 13, Presentation 2. Let's talk about some misconceptions. We are humans, not human races. There is no biological support for the existence of human races. That is a fact. There is racism. It is all around us. Racism does not have its origins in evolutionary history, primate, mammal, vertebrate, chordate, or animal. Instead, like the concept of race, racism is a product of Homo sapiens culture and history. Most individuals link themselves with at least one cultural group and its traditions. This is ethnicity. As an anthropologist, I love learning about every person's cultural heritage, customs, and traditions. It's fascinating. Why else would I choose to be an anthropologist if I didn't love all of our cultural behaviors? But here is a fact. Your ethnicity may have very little to do with your biological ancestry. For example, my family members claim an Irish American heritage. They love St. Paddy's Day and assume that their red hair and freckles are proof of their Irish ancestry. Well, what does my genetic ancestry over the last 10,000 years indicate? There is no support for Irish heritage in my biological ancestry. You can find people with my genes in Spain, North Africa, Russia, parts of Europe, particularly around the Balkans and Mediterranean, and up into Scandinavia and Scotland, but no Ireland. The closest any of my people ever came to Ireland may have been as Viking invaders. These are my people returning from a trip to IKEA, which I admit I love. Okay, if my family wants to continue celebrating an Irish ethnicity, that's all right. I'm not going to tell them. That is the identity of their cultural beliefs. It doesn't matter because even if they had Irish genes, ethnicity is too recent to be biologically meaningful. Culturally meaningful? You bet. But ethnicity is about recent tradition. It is not about biology. For most of us, our ethnicities are about traditions in recent millennia, but modern humans have been around for 200,000 years. We have to remember an important fact. With every generation back in time, our ancestors double in number. Who here can account for the 2,097,150 individuals who comprised the first 20 generations of your ancestors? Huh? All right, so let's do the math. Based on average generation length, that is about 25 years in our species, a child born in 2010 had 2,097,150 ancestors dating back to about 1510 AD. So that child had two parents, both of whom were born around 1985, 16 great-great-grandparents born in about 1910, 128 great-great-great-great-great-grandparents born in about 1835, 2,048 great-whatever grandparents born in 1735, 65,536 great-whatever grandparents born in 1610, and 1,048,576 great-whatever grandparents born in 1510. Add them all up, and that is 2,097,150 great and whatever grandparents for the first 20 generations back in time to 1510 AD, which is nothing in terms of geologic time. That is 20 generations. The numbers are crazy if we go further back in time. Think about this. How many generations back in time do we need to go before all of us share a common great whatever granny? According to computational biologists, the answer is 3,000 years. Now, that's not unreasonable considering that we are 99.9% similar in our DNA. Well then, what about our races? That depends on your understanding of the term race. Race is everywhere. The 2010 census form asked for race. Well, back in the day when I was a graduate student and the census taker showed up at my front door and asked me what my race was, I reported it was African. This is absolutely factual for all of us. 200,000 years ago, all of us were in Africa. Well, they got wise to folks like me, and now the race question is tied to skin color. And that makes me want to scream. Why is this so? The correlation between skin color and race is hugely misleading. Skin color has a biological basis. Race does not. This is one of the most common misconceptions today. Humans are divisible into races which are genetically distinct biological units. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Here are the facts. Racial categories are a product of cultural histories and traditions. Folk categories of race are moving targets which vary regionally and culturally, from skin color to religion, language, and etc., including how hairy you are in some places. Folk categories of race are moving targets which vary regionally and culturally. Scientific categories of human races are non-existent. In order to understand the scientific problem with race categories, we must begin with a history of racial categorization. Race history, not biology. If we go back 4,000 years ago or so to dynastic Egypt, we can observe visual abstractions, pictures of human traits tied to geography to depict folk racial categories. This is an Egyptian tomb painting from 1350 BC. The red-skinned people depict Egyptians, yellow-skinned people, Asians, white-skinned people, Europeans, and black-skinned people depict Africans. Move forward a few thousand years to the Age of Exploration, roughly 1450 to 1750 AD, when Europeans began to map newly discovered places and their natural resources. European contact with new peoples occurred on a global scale. Like ancient Egyptians, Europeans sorted people into folk racial categories on the basis of skin color tied to geography. What was new? Maps. Visual depictions of humans in particular geographic locations were mapped out in detailed caricatures, like cartoons, of typological specimens representing the physical and cultural appearance of entire populations. Note that variation itself was not addressed. This was not Darwinian. Here we see peoples of Asia depicted along the side panels of this geographic map made by Willem Blau. And he took the traditional clothing and depicted the peoples of major centers around Asia. And here we have a similar type of caricaturization for the Americas from 1627 by John Speed. He is depicting the peoples of North and South America in their traditional clothing. Again, it's a one-size-fits-all category. There is no deviation from the type. It's typological thinking. And this one is really worth looking at further. Let's examine the four corners of the world in this 1652 map. Each is a continent represented as a woman. We have Europa up in the upper left corner. She is wearing rich royal robes. Notice she has a crown atop her head with the symbol of Christianity, the cross. She's holding a scepter in her hand, the symbol of royalty. And she is in a very pastoral setting with domesticated animals around her. Now move over to the other side and we have Asia. Asia is also dressed in rich robes, and Asia is sitting on a camel and she's swinging an object carrying incense. Asia represents the trade of the region. So trade involving camels, incense, etc. Now let's go back underneath Europa and go to America. America is almost naked. She's carrying dangerous weapons, bow and arrow and a tomahawk, and she's sitting atop a wild animal, in this case a giant armadillo, surrounded by a wild setting. Things look very dangerous here. And then let's go across to Africa. She's pretty much naked. She's not carrying anything other than a plant for whatever reason. She's sitting on top of a dangerous animal, a crocodilian. In the background, you can see all sorts of carnivores around her, and she obviously is not of the same ilk as Europa or Asia or America. One funny thing in this picture, there is a dangerous land octopus right beneath the crocodilian's tail. It is a fact that some populations portrayed in these maps were viewed as commodities, and the connection to large-scale slave trading cannot be overlooked. The primary objects of this business were the dark-skinned peoples of Africa. The mapping of folk races gave a veneer of legitimacy to the caricatures. Mapping, after all, was conducted by governments and technically trained map makers engaged in geographic science. The first attempts to systematically define the races of man began in 1758 with Linnaeus. Remember, Linnaeus devised the binomial system of classification. The most exclusive taxonomic level is subspecies. Taxonomic rule number 1. All taxonomic categories consist of discrete units defined by discrete traits, present or absent. There cannot be overlap between same level categories. In the language of science, a subspecies taxon is equivalent to race, so a valid race cannot overlap with its sister race. You're either in or you're out. In 1758, Linnaeus's human classification identified 4 races, each a subspecies of Homo sapiens. There was Homo sapiens europaeus, Homo sapiens asiaticus, Homo sapiens americanus, and Homo sapiens africanus. The taxonomic traits that Linnaeus used: skin color, geography, personality, posture, customs. Huh? From the beginning, all scientific attempts to sort humans into racial categories were influenced by ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the belief in the inherent superiority of one's own group. Members of other groups are viewed as inferior. Others are not simply different, they are worse because they are different. For example, compare the traits used to classify Homo sapiens into subspecies races. Note, the following is an example of how biased and ethnocentric racial classification was from the start. These descriptions are invalid and they do not come from me. The European race was defined as white, sanguine, confident, muscular, ruled by custom. The Asian race was defined as pale yellow, melancholy, meaning moody, stiff, ruled by opinion. The American race was defined as red, choleric, easily angered, upright, ruled by habit. And the African race was described and defined as black, phlegmatic, meaning lazy, relaxed, ruled by caprice, whim. Linnaeus's work was continued by his pupil, a German anatomist named Blumenbach. In 1795, Blumenbach recognized 5 races: The white-skinned Caucasians, the yellow-skinned Mongolians, the red-skinned Americans, the brown-skinned Malaysians, and the black-skinned Ethiopians. Neither Linnaeus nor Blumenbach were evolutionists. Both predated Darwin. Like many of his peers, Blumenbach thought that races were produced by degeneration from a pure form. Blumenbach concluded that the white-skinned Caucasians were the least degenerated from the perfect human type. At the same time that Blumenbach engaged in race-based classification, he complained that human subspecies categories were not discrete. That is a violation of taxonomic rule number 1. Well, one problem involved the use of behavioral traits, phlegmatic, caprice, etc. Behaviors are difficult to identify and quantify. The larger problem concerned the use of physical traits such as skin color. Skin color is a continuous trait. It is not a discrete trait. The results of recognizing that skin color and other subspecies traits were not discrete should have caused researchers to rethink the validity of racial categorization. Instead, it inspired a search for better indicators, traits of race. Most of these new indicators focused on cranial traits. A Swedish anthropologist, Anders Ritzius, used cranial anthropometric methods to determine cephalic index as a measure of racial identity. The cephalic index was thought to be a surrogate for brain size. Actually, it's a measure of cranial shape, not size. But in those days, brain size was viewed as a correlate of intelligence. So, how do you get cephalic index, which is a legitimate measurement for other reasons? You take maximum cranial breadth from side to side, multiply it times 100, and divide it by maximum cranial length from just above the nose to the back of the head. Ritzius cephalic index categories. Absolutely don't waste your time memorizing these. I'm just going to explain them. Dolichocephalic. That is a cranial index of 75 or less. That is a narrow face and long head. Mesocephalic. A cranial index of 75.1 to 79.99. Normal. Brachycephalic, a cranial index of 80 to 84.99, a broad face and short head. And hyperbrachycephalic, a cranial index or cephalic index of 85 plus, very broad from side to side and short from front to back. Ritzius applied his cephalic index categories to Europeans from different geographic regions. He found that Northern Europeans were dolichocephalic and Southern Europeans were brachycephalic. Of course, this sparked intense debate about which Europeans had the best head shape and were, as a result, smartest. As a Swede, Ritzius favored dolichocephalic. Anders Ritzius had a son, Gustav Ritzius, who carried on with his father's work with craniometry. A physician, zoologist, botanist, and biologist, he was a medical professor and made significant contributions to knowledge of the central nervous system. However, he was one of the founding fathers of scientific race studies and viewed the Nordic races as superior to all others. By the mid-1800s, populations all over the world were assessed for cephalic index type as a measure of racial classification, and data were collected well into the next century. This is a cephalic index map from 1950 from the Sears Roebuck Encyclopedia of World Places. By 1950, populations all over the world had been sorted into 11 races on the basis of skin color. Bottom line, no matter which variables were examined, racial classification always resulted in a hierarchical scale. Light-skinned Europeans were ranked higher than dark-skinned Europeans. Europeans and European descendants ranked higher than non-Europeans. For many Westerners, the results validated the Eurocentric notion that non-Europeans were less civilized, and inferior in character and intellect. Result, race studies supported colonialism. Now you are ready for Lecture 13, Presentation 3.